I'm sure none of us have failed to be aware of an intensifying, gripping news story from the former Soviet Republic, now the independent nation of Ukraine. On the Black Sea, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union's 70 years, now a proud independent nation whose independence is threatened. And this is our 1776 self-evident truths theme, brought to life by 4 eyewitnesses. 2 who have grown up in Ukraine, 1 from neighboring Moldova, and then an American from Wyoming, not that much older than lots of our CCU students who are here this evening, each in their own way having vivid testimony about what's going on in Ukraine, why it should matter to you and me as Americans in distant and safe and sometimes complacently secure Colorado. I want you to know and hear from, and as the evening goes along, to be able to dialogue with Jillian Melchior and Olena, Poplavska, and Anastasiya, Kozlovtseva, and Vitalie Diaconu. In reverse order, Mr. Diaconu is from Moldova. He's a diplomat in his country's service, right now stationed in Vienna, Austria, with Moldova's delegation to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He has a master's degree in international policy studies from the Monterey, California Graduate School, one of the most distinguished institutions in this country. Colorado Christian University knows him because he befriended and assisted our own history professor, Dr. Bill Watson, during Dr. Watson's Fulbright Fellowship teaching year in Moldova a decade ago. Anastasiya Kozlovtseva, punish me later, I'm still not saying it right, Anastasiya. Just 23, already has seen a lot of life, including the violence raining down on peaceful protesters in the central square, the Maidan of Kiev, Ukraine, which you will hear related by several of our speakers this evening. She now works for Transparency International, which is active in many countries of the world, based out of Berlin, Germany. And as the name suggests, its mission is to deal with corruption in governments, all countries of the world. It's a severe problem in Ukraine, and Anastasiya will tell us about what's being done. Olena Poplavska has a master's degree in international relations, as well as a bachelor's degree. Her master's degree is from University in Rhode Island, I think you said, Salve Regina in Rhode Island. You'll find her English is excellent. She has recently emigrated from Ukraine to live in Michigan, in Grand Rapids, bringing her American husband, their 2 little daughters, her mother and father. A dramatic story where her father in his 50s was subject to conscription to help Ukraine defend itself against the slow-motion Russian invasion of its east. Now they're Americans by choice. Born in America, formed the dream of reporting from the hot spots of the world when she was still a Hillsdale College student, Wyoming native Jillian Melchior, now works for National Review magazine, which she first became close to through corresponding while she was still a college student with its late founder, William F. Buckley. CCU students, this is the kind of initiative that we love it when you take, when those doors open, because you said, I think I'll try pushing on that door. Jillian isn't yet 30. She's already accomplished so much. She's worked for the News Corporation, reporting from China. She has worked for Commentary magazine. She's a Thomas Rhodes Fellow, working now in many journalistic beats, including foreign correspondent for National Review magazine. Let's start with Jillian Melchior's first-person report from being in Kiev just shortly after the Maidan Revolution of a year ago and bringing us up to date to the struggle that continues now against Putin's invasion and the new Cold War. Start by welcoming, please, Jillian Melchior.
On a chilly morning last April, a 19-year-old girl sat across from me in a booth in Kiev. She looked like an Urban Outfitters model. She had long red hair, red lipstick, knee-high socks, combat boots. She was awesome. We sat there and we talked about F. Scott Fitzgerald. She thought it was so weird that such a compelling writer could love communism. And then we delved into the real reason that we'd gotten together to talk. And that was to discuss her new specialty, Molotov cocktails. And she had learned this skill participating in the Ukrainian Revolution, Maidan. Ukrainians fought back against a corrupt and increasingly despotic leader named Viktor Yanukovych. And they succeeded in deposing him. But more than a year later, Ukrainians are still fighting for their freedoms. Except this time, it's against an external force. Now, the crisis in Ukraine has been eclipsed by a lot of other news. The news of the Islamic State, chaos in the Middle East. But as a new generation of young people struggles for the most fundamental liberties, the world should take note. Petro Poroshenko, who is Ukraine's new president, said it well to Congress this last September. He said, quote, "The outcome of today's war will determine whether we will be forced to accept the reality of a dark, torn, bitter Europe as part of the New World Order." Now, how the United States responds to this crisis also profoundly matters. It says much about our changing role in global affairs and what the consequences will be for the people who share our values. So the story of the crisis in Ukraine begins with Viktor Yanukovych, Putin on the sideline, pulling the strings of his puppet. And Yanukovych ruled with a level of corruption that has to be seen to be believed. And fortunately, you can actually see it on a 12-mile drive outside of Kiev. The city's traffic is abhorrent, even in times of stability. But Yanukovych never had to deal with that jam. And that's because when he wanted to drive, he simply shut down roads, leaving the rest of the commuters stranded, exacerbating everything. And on one highway to his mansion, Medjugorje, Yanukovych designated an exclusive lane for his use, zipping past everyone as he went. Medjugorje, the estate, stands today as a monument to corruption. It's the product of more than $1 billion, pilfered, Russian style, from the Ukrainian people. And it's objectively hideous. It's proof that money can't buy taste. So Yanukovych actually started building his castle in a Greco-Roman architecture style, changed his mind halfway through, decided that maybe Victorian would be a better look. And then his builders got through the second floor before he decided that he was actually going to top it off as a log cabin. It's even sillier looking than you would imagine. Now, the rest of the estate sprawls. It's equally dissonant and warped. And Medjugorje had a menagerie. It actually included about 2,000 rare and exotic animals, many of which had been smuggled into Ukraine, including African elands, mountain goats, white ostriches, a wild boar domesticated pig hybrid. And Yanukovych, actually, believe it or not, was no animal lover. He kept these rare animals as a show of wealth. He would butcher them and serve them for dinner to his wealthy friends that he wanted to impress, including perhaps Putin, who had a cabin of his own on Medjugorje. I stayed in Putin's bedroom. So as Medjugorje's decadent disorder deepened, Ukraine's house also grew more divided. Observing the corruption of Yanukovych and his cronies, the Ukrainian people contemplated their lot in life, and it wasn't good. We're talking about a people whose per capita GDP was less than $4,000 a year. We're talking about young people who are facing unemployment rates around 20%. And we're talking about a population that can't find work or can't get promoted based on their merits because the corruption is so entrenched in the system that it chokes off their opportunity. So understandably, Ukrainians were fed up with this corrupt, Russian-centric system, and they yearned for opportunities for growth. They thought that by building an economic relationship with the West, perhaps they could become more Western and share in the prosperity. But when the chance for a trade deal came around, Yanukovych vetoed it. And this decision kowtowed to Putin at the expense of the Ukrainian people. They were furious. So Ukrainians took to the street to protest. Now, at first, the protesters were mostly young people, college students, high schoolers. A lot of them heard about the protests at Maidan through Facebook. And they went and camped out, brought signs, blankets, and at first it was actually pretty fun and artistic. But then Yanukovych's troops showed up on November 30th. They're called the Berkut, the riot police. They carried tear gas and batons, and they attacked these peaceful protesters. One man that I spoke to vividly recalls hunching his body over a teenage girl, blows raining down on him more than he can count, and everywhere he looked, 4 or 5 Berkut were surrounding lone student protesters, hitting them, beating them, relentlessly. So a mile down the road, a priest heard about what was happening at an old church. He climbed to the rooftop, grabbed the rope, and began ringing the bell. Now, in the olden days, the church bell's clack warned of an attack on the city. And the bell clanged, and Kiev's residents woke up and heard this clanging, and they got the message. Yanukovych had turned on his own people. Ukraine was under attack. Suddenly, Maidan was no longer about a trade deal. It was about the rejection of Putin and Russia. It was about a people that were sick of corruption and oppression. It was a reaffirmation of Western values, Western ideals, and about a thirst for liberty. Hundreds of Ukrainians poured into Maidan. They wanted to help. They brought tires to melt for barricades, blankets, supplies, everything they could. And as the winter continued, the police often continued to rough up the protesters, and gangs of thugs beat them up too. In fact, many say that Yanukovych may have freed violent criminals from the prisons on the understanding that they'd go beat up the Maidaners. But the Maidaners persevered. And because we're at Colorado Christian University, I want to share one anecdote that I thought was particularly fascinating. These protests were happening during the Feast of the Epiphany, and the riot police turned on the water cannon and started shooting at the people. But as we all know, Epiphany, you get sprinkled with water. So they were out on the streets yelling, "Epiphany, Epiphany, freedom." But not all of it was quite so light. In fact, much of it wasn't. In fact, a famous Ukrainian artist that I spoke to recalled one uncanny moment where he and the fellow Maidaners squared off against the Berkut. Now, the protesters all wore these scavenged helmets, but they were special. Maidaners had painted pictures on them, so each one was individual and unique. And this artist remembered facing off against the Berkut, the riot police, and seeing them mirror images of each other, armed up to the teeth. And he was completely awestruck, because for him, this was a physical and tangible symbolism. It was the individual spirit standing up against the authoritarian government. That stand had fatal consequences. Among the first to die was Sergei Nigoyan. He was a 20-year-old Armenian guy from eastern central Ukraine, and he'd bought a train ticket right away. He didn't even call his parents until after he'd arrived in Maidan. And they were nervous, but he told them, "I want to be here. I want to be here for the sake of my country and my future." He told this to a reporter that I later spoke to. He couldn't tell me himself, because a few weeks later, he was shot 4 times in the neck and the head, and he died bleeding on Gruchevsky Street, a couple of blocks over from Maidan. Now, the violence continued to escalate, peaking in what Ukrainians refer to as the dark days, which began on February 18th. Yanukovych and his troops knew that the protesters were not going to back down, and so they resorted to deadly violence. And the tragedy and the courage that unfolded there can't really be understood without a grasp of the geography. Maidan is a city center, but it's very low. Around it are hills, bridges, high buildings. And the Berkut stood above, and they started shooting tear gas and dropping grenades down onto the very vulnerable protesters. Protesters stood, didn't budge. Then came the bullets from the sky, hitting and killing many protesters. Over the next few days, 100 men, many of them barely even adults, perished. Despite their commitment to peace, the protesters understood that they had no choice but to defend themselves. They could leave, or they could die on the spot, or they could fight. And that's what they did. So Sophia, the 19-year-old girl I mentioned, volunteered to make Molotov cocktails. She mixed jellied petrol, stones, chemicals, red pepper in glass bottles. And she and others worked on the outskirts of Maidan. Yanukovych's troops knew their location, and they sent snipers to shoot in and aim where they were making these Molotov cocktails. So Sophia's sitting there, and she tells me that someone turns to her and says, "Don't worry, the bullets usually ricochet." She did not find that very reassuring. But she stuck to it anyway. And over the next few days, it was completely frigid outside, but she wouldn't venture near the bonfires all over Maidan because she reeked of petrol and she was afraid she was going to immolate. She's not the only one that made a big sacrifice for her country. I remember talking to a girl named Galina. She was 23 years old, and she volunteered to provide emergency care for injured protesters. When you were wounded in Maidan, you couldn't go to a regular hospital. The Berkut would sometimes seize the injured protesters and haul them off to prison, and others simply disappeared, never heard from again. So Galina and her friends raised money and set up secret hospitals and churches and office buildings and homes. They even raised money for state-of-the-art equipment. Doctors and nurses volunteered to help out, and private citizens and businesses chipped in for supplies. Ukraine's medical system had long been lacking, but within a few days, the Ukrainian protesters set up makeshift hospitals that were even better than the Ukrainian official hospitals. So, because of the efforts of people like Sophia and Galina, the Ukrainians eventually won. Yanukovych fled to Russia in late February. And at that moment, the Ukrainians had their best chance for establishing a real democracy that protected rights in at least a century. These people hungered for a political order that protected the rights of citizens rather than violating them. But at precisely that key juncture, Putin decided he was going to pounce. Russia attacked, seizing Crimea in the south and invading eastern Ukraine. Yanukovych had already cut the military severely, and the Ukrainians to this day remain at very tough odds as the war continues. This really hit home for me when I was talking to a Ukrainian military officer named Dmitry. I'll never forget it. We went to his house. I think he smiled when I walked in the door, and after that, grim-faced. The mood was incredibly heavy, and we sat on his couch. He had a pretty blonde wife, and their toddler was napping in his lap. And he talked about what he'd seen and his country's odds. At the start of the conflict, Russia had 4 times the soldiers and as much as 48 times a bigger budget than Ukraine. So Dmitry told me, knowing that he might have to go out to the front lines and fight, quote, "Without military help from the West, it would be very difficult for Ukraine to protect its independence in a war like this one." Yet Western help remains completely fleeting. Ukraine has repeatedly asked the United States and Europe for lethal military aid. It hasn't been forthcoming. Even after US Congress authorized the Obama administration to give lethal aid, the Obama administration has done not much. We've offered only skimpy intelligence, non-lethal aid, and sanctions against Russia, which thus far haven't been effective in stopping the aggression. Now, this lack of commitment has continued despite the United States' prior commitments to Kiev. After the Cold War, Ukraine had the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and it gave that up. It gave it up for promises that the United States, Britain, and you're going to love this one, Russia, would protect it. That hasn't happened. Today, Putin continues to chip away at Ukraine's territory. Russia covertly sends troops and tanks across the border. It arms pro-Russian rebels with the lethal weapons that Ukraine covets. In March, the death toll from this conflict surpassed 6,000. And by my calculations, more than 5,000 gallons of blood have been spilled out east alone. Yet the West continues to respond with ineffective diplomacy and insufficient aid. Ukraine's patriots are trying to make up the difference. Young people repeatedly told me, all I want in my life, not a good job, not to find love. I want freedom. I want rule of law for my country. I want an end to corruption, and I want Western-style government. And that is a dream that they've proven completely willing to sacrifice for. After the slaughter that happened at Maidan, I think they know the stakes. So I want to give you some examples about how Ukrainian patriots are helping this military effort, and I think the one that fascinated me most was last spring, the Ukrainian government did this phone campaign where you donate to the military for military or logistics support. Now remember, Ukraine is in a severe economic rut, yet within just a couple days, $2.3 million raised, mostly from 50-cent donations. Citizens have also led their own war support efforts. I talked to a guy named Ilya Timchenko. He started an Indiegogo campaign, which he publicized through Facebook, raising money for coagulants and bandages to help soldiers not bleed to death on the front lines. And he coordinated the logistics all through Facebook, how to get them from the US or Israel, bring them to Ukraine, and get them out to the front lines. These volunteer efforts are incredible, and that's not only because they're supporting the fight against Russia, but because more subtly, they're teaching Ukrainians how to self-govern. Working toward a common goal, Ukrainians are beginning to partner with perfect strangers, and that's rebuilding civic trust. That's no small accomplishment for a country that ranked 144th on Transparency International's 2013 Corruption Index. For some frame of reference, that's on par with Bangladesh and Syria. So finally, to borrow a concept from Tocqueville, citizens who rise up like this to meet societal needs through private sector efforts, through independent charity, they end up strengthening their own capacity to enjoy freedom. Ukraine's fate has yet to be determined. Might has trumped right many times historically. And Kiev's undertrained, under-equipped military forms a ragtag force against Putin's well-trained, well-equipped forces. But the commendable grit, ethic, and commitment to Western values that Ukrainians have demonstrated certainly give ample reason for optimism. I wish the United States would follow Ukraine's example and stand up to Putin's deplorable aggression. Thank you.
Jillian Melchior, gripping, magnificent. Thank you, Jillian. Sobering. Now, the two young ladies we'll hear from next, we are blessed that they have come into CCU's orbit by way of our professor in the business school, Kyle Usry, who knew them when he was leading a Lithuanian Christian college, and they were both students of his at that college on the Baltic Sea, far north of their native Ukraine. Olena, would you please give us your perspective following on to Jillian's introduction?
Well, thank you, Julian, for a great introduction. It just brought me back to the scenes of Maidan that I have seen so clearly last year and year and a half. Is it on? Actually, need to put it closer. Okay. Yes, and I just wanted to speak a little more for the reasons for the conflict, since we've been talking about Ukraine and Russia, and as you described what has happened in Ukraine, you probably know that Russia and Ukraine has very long history and long ties, and it is true that we stem from the Slavic nation, stem from the same root. We have very similar languages. The Russian Orthodox religion was actually, Kiev was the first one who adopted Christianity in that region, so Kiev is actually known as the cradle of Russian Orthodox, and that's what makes the connection so close and so important. We have been united, we have been very close in ethnicity since 800s, Ukraine did not really have very long periods of independence, even though having its own ethnicity. First, it has been under Lithuanian Commonwealth of Lithuanian state, that it has been under the Polish empire. Then in 1500s it became part of Russian Empire, and has been the eastern part and central part of Ukraine has been part of Russian Empire, whereas the western part of Ukraine has been under the Hungary Empire for a while, and then it transpired into the Soviet Union as the Russian Empire collapsed. Throughout those years, Ukraine has been part of Soviet Union, and in 1991 it became an independent country. Although what I find important to say that unlike the Baltic states or Poland, other Eastern European countries that were part of the Soviet bloc, Ukraine never had to fight for its independence. We sort of have been given it. My parents went to the referendum, they voted for independent Ukraine 23 years ago, but not much has changed in the minds of people. And only now, 23 years later, it's the young generation that spurred up throughout this time, and now actually is the time when the real nation of Ukraine is being born in a very, very sacrificial way, in a very painful way. So as we became independent, not much has changed. Pretty much the same people stayed in power. They just changed their names from Communist Party into Democratic Party, but the same system has remained in place. And the first spur of the democratic aspirations of Ukrainian people has actually resulted in Orange Revolution. If some of you remember, 10 years ago, that was pretty much the first time Ukraine got into international news with the orange flags. That was the elections that were presidential elections were fraud, and people of Ukraine took to the streets demanding re-election. That was pretty much the only right Ukrainians as citizens were seeing themselves involved in. As a citizen, I have a right to vote, and that has been jeopardized. And therefore, I take my right and I demand the re-election. So the re-election has happened, and well, we could call him pro-Western person came to power, but not much has changed even in 2004. The hopes in 2004 were so high with the Orange Revolution, although people were still putting their trust in their person who will bring them closer to the West, who will bring not corrupt government, who will change the system. So even though we have seen the birth of some democratic tendencies in Ukrainian society, the people were still not ready for the self-governance. They were not ready to take responsibility on themselves for making their lives better. They were thinking that this person we elected will make it better. Well, it didn't happen. The system never changed, and that resulted in a great disillusion from the people, which brought Viktor Yanukovych, the former president, into power. And we have heard about his approach to power and how seriously he took it. Only now, as the revolution of dignity, as we call it, happened in 2013, this was the people of Ukraine who actually realized that we are the power and we have a right to make changes in the country. And a lot of great processes are happening now, because we actually witness right now, only 23 years later, the system is being changed, and it will take years and it will take a lot of effort. But the point has the Ukrainian history has turned, and I really hope that it's a point of no return for for reforms and for a clear future for my country. I also wanted to mention that period when the Yanukovych was gone was really short, because apparently Putin could not conceive that people of Ukraine could have that much strength to actually to stand for themselves. So shortly enough, Crimea, the peninsula that is so famous, a small little place but so important for geopolitics, has been annexed by Russia. The importance of that peninsula is that it actually has no land connection to Russia. 80–90% of its gas, water, food, budget money has been subsidized by Ukraine. So it makes no sense for Russia to have Crimea from any other point, but for just ambition and political reasons. And shortly after Crimea has been annexed, and which is a huge violation of international law. I mean, there were so many UN Security councils on the topic saying that this is illegal, this is not, that cannot happen. Well, it did happen. Even though the international community does not recognize that Crimea belongs to Russia, but it is belonging to Russia at this point. The Russian currency functioning there, the institutes of authorities are presented in Crimea. And very shortly after Crimea, the same scenario was implemented in eastern Ukraine, and it didn't go as well as probably the plan was, and that's when the fight and the real war has started and is going on even now. And another thing, maybe you have read that there is debate, well, is Ukraine a split country? Part of it supports Russia, part of it supports the West. The truth is that there is this phenomena in Ukraine. A lot of percentage of Eastern Ukrainians do speak Russian language. People in the West are more comfortable speaking Ukrainian language. I myself grew up speaking Russian. My whole family speaks Russian. I know Ukrainian. I'm very comfortable and fluent in Ukrainian. And millions of people can say the same, even though the language has been used as the reason for the war, as the reason to escalate the conflict. It's completely artificial, because the Ukrainians who actually live on the land can tell you that, no, we have not been persecuted as Russian speakers in Ukraine. And the reason for a lot of ethnicity, that people who would say that they are actually Russian, is that during Soviet times, Stalin was using such thing as shuffling the ethnicities. So he would forcefully bring Latvians into Russia, Russians into Latvia, just changing to keep people calm and not to oppose the government, just mixing them up. And in 1920s, in the breadbasket of Ukraine, a forced starvation happened that led to death of millions of Ukrainian ethnicity, and then a Russian population has been forcefully brought into this land. So that's how we do have many people who consider themselves ethnic Russians and speak Russian language, and that's what Putin is using as a leverage for the conflict, because according to Russian propaganda, those people need help. But if you talk to the people that need help, they would probably tell you that we actually don't need help. We are okay. Just leave us alone and let us live in peace. And as Ukraine is struggling with the war at one front, at the same time it's trying to rebuild its system with the struggling economy, and a lot of great things in the burst of civil society are happening at this point. And I want to give the floor. Are you going to give the floor to Anastasiya?
Give it to your colleague. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So, Anastasiya, Kozlovtseva, pick it up about civil society. I think Jillian gave us a good lead in there. And what about the work that you're doing with Transparency International?
So, my father is Russian, and he was the first from our family to go to Maidan and to join the protest. And what we saw there, when I was in Kiev and I spent one night at this protest, what I saw there, a unity of people, how people are united. It's not common to speak to strangers in Ukraine, but when I went to the main square of Kiev, to Maidan, people were talking to me, asking if I needed anything, if I needed some heat from the barrel, or if I wanted to eat some food, or if I needed a place to sleep there, which was really amazing to me, and my pride in Ukrainians grew up a lot at that time. So what happened there, people were living in tents on the main square for some months, and of course they had to self-organize somehow to have the food provided, to have self-defense provided from the riot police, which was mentioned, which was beating up the people there. And this self-organization level was so high, people just, I don't know, it somehow happened in weeks. There was self-defense, there was the culinary 100, what was called. People were coming and cooking, volunteers were bringing clothing and so on. So after the protest finished, there is whole bunch of people who want to do something for their country, but they don't know how to do it except for the protest. What Transparency International Ukraine is doing, we are trying to give practical instruments to the people's hands that they could eliminate corruption in Ukraine, combat it wherever they are. For example, one thing is what we are doing, we are looking at asset declarations of the public officials, looking how much money they get, what cars they possess, and then we are comparing it to their real lifestyles. Is this true that you're having that car which you rode there? Is your child studying in Oxford and you told you just get 100,000 Ukrainian hryvnias per year? Is that really possible? So what we are trying to do is bring media attention, bring international attention to these discrepancies, then that the public officials would be prosecuted, so the corruption would be eliminated. Another thing what we are doing is advocacy work for whistleblowing protection, for whistleblowers. Historically, whistleblowing is not perceived well in Ukraine. It's like you are telling something bad about your neighbor, which is like your, what's the word? Sniff? Snitch. Thank you. My organization, Transparency International Ukraine, we decided to find a different word for that, which would not have this bad connotation. So what we are using now is like uncovering the truth. We are empowering people to tell about corrupt cases, to eliminate corruption wherever they are, at their work, at their education. It's normal in Ukraine, in the universities, to pay a bribe to your teacher to get a good grade. So we want to change that. And there is a lot of people who want to do that, but the system is so corrupt that it's very hard to do that by, like, if one person does that. So Transparency International provides these instruments which any person could use to combat corruption. Another thing what we are doing, what we are teaching people to do is monitor the public procurement processes. There are online platforms where you can see which ministry bought what thing and for what price. If you see that the price is 5 times higher than the market price for computers, for example, you could think that there is something wrong there. So basically what we are doing, we are just going around Ukraine, teaching regular people, asking for volunteers to help us in this work. And because the civil society emerged from the protest, they want to do something, there is a great demand for that. Another part of work, what we are doing, there has been a coalition of civil society organizations which emerged after this Euromaidan. It's about 50 civil society organizations and more than 100 civil society experts. They decided to come together and think of reforms which could be done in different spheres in Ukraine. They are divided into working groups. For example, my organization is the lead organization in anti-corruption working group. There is working group on administrative reform, on education reform, and so on and so forth. So the people would get together and think, okay, what should be done in Ukraine, what reforms should be done in Ukraine to make it a non-corrupt state, to make it a prosperous state, to embrace the values which we always tried for. And then we draft the laws for Ukraine, which would benefit Ukraine, which would eliminate corruption. On the 14th of October 2014, the package of anti-corruption laws was adopted, which was promoted and which was co-drafted with the civil society leaders. After the new parliament was elected in Ukraine, some civil society leaders went to the political parties and joined the parliament, so now we have our associates in the parliament. So this civil society coalition, which I told you, which is more than 50 organizations and even more experts, they would draft the laws, they would set the civil society agenda for the parliament sessions, they would meet the parliamentarians in front of the parliamentary building every time they have the parliamentary session and say, okay, this is the infographics, there are the numbers of the law the civil society needs to be adopted today, and these are the reasons why. And you need to do this. If not, well, you saw Maidan. So the difference between the revolution before in 2004 and now in 2013 and 14 is that people are not voting or demanding a person in power or a political party in power. They demand someone in power who would work for the citizens of Ukraine, not for their own pockets and money. We chose Poroshenko, but if Poroshenko doesn't comply with that, he would be put down. And the thing what really changed after the protest is that the government is kind of afraid of its people. They saw what the people can do. So now the paradigm so the paradigm is changing. So the government would work for people, but not for themselves, and it's something very new in Ukraine. Another thing what we are doing is we are demanding more transparent government, more accountable government, more participation of the citizens in the politics of the government. If before citizens perceived the participation is once in 4 years, you just go and vote, now citizens see that the revolution, the protest, it hasn't stopped. That was the small part of it. Now is the big part, the implementation of these reforms, bringing up that. But it's very good excuse for the government and for some civil society leaders is, okay, we have the war now, how can we make reforms? We don't have, our budget is empty, Yanukovych stole everything we had. But the thing is that civil society and people of Ukraine, they believe in these values and future so much, they are ready to sacrifice what they have. In this economic crisis which we have, many people would just bring the food they have for the soldiers. My father is a seaman, he's at sea right now. She took almost all of his clothing and brought it to the soldiers to send it to the front. My other friend thought, okay, I don't have money, I am young, but what can I do for the soldiers? She took other girlfriends which looked really nice. They asked a photographer to make pictures of them for free. They made a calendar for 2015. They sold the calendar and they got the money to provide for the soldiers. But this is all like good parts. There is a sad part to the war in Ukraine. I have a friend, Andrei. He helped me when I wanted to jump with the parachute. He brought me to the place and he was with me there. He has a nice wife. He had a 3-year-old kid. He was in the military, so he had to go to the war right when it started. He was in the specialized forces, and they went at night, I think it was 11 at night. They went to see where the Russians were, but they were shot there. And now he has a wife and a 3-year-old kid without a father. Almost every week, 2 times per week, we would have dead bodies coming into my hometown, and the whole town would gather for the funerals. There is not much government support for the families because, as you see, the budget is empty. We need to support the soldiers. We need to make reforms in Ukraine, and this is a really hard time for Ukrainians. But the unity which is there, people crying out to God. On the 23rd of March, we got this tents on the main squares of many cities, which like a prayer tent, which anyone could come in and pray and get a New Testament or the prayer book. My church has been volunteering in this front at the war. 1 time per week, people would go to the front, would bring some humanitarian aid, as well as prayer books and New Testaments to the soldiers. When Andrei was still alive, I don't know why, but I didn't talk to him for some time, but a week before he died, I just felt I needed to chat with him. So I wrote him on Russian Facebook, and we chatted for some time, and he said, I feel this unity here, even though it's war and it's scary, but people are so united here, and I feel that I can preach the gospel, spread the word here. People are accepting because it's life and death. There is not much which you can say, oh, it's on me. I can, rule my life by myself. And right before he died that day, I accidentally called him, and I heard his voice. And our last words were, okay, if God is for us, who can be against us? That's what he said. And he said, I'm going off for dinner, which was 7 p.m. And then when I found out he was dead, he was shot at 11 p.m. Yeah.
Anastasiya, that is so inspiring. Thank you very much. Friends, I cited Alexander Hamilton, age 20, a young patriot, embodied the spirit of 1776. That spirit knows no boundaries of the 50 United States. you see represented before you the spirit of 1776 of today in 2015 halfway around the world, our friends from Ukraine. Vitalie Diaconu, give us a perspective, perhaps more broadly, about what it means for Russia to be destabilizing Europe, the slow motion annexation of a neighboring independent country, and meaningless, if any, resistance from the international community, America, the European Union, and the West. What's at stake, Vitalie?
Thank you, Director Andrews. Before I start my speech, let me just make one brief remark that I'm speaking in my personal capacity and I'm now speaking in an official capacity, so the views expressed here should not be interpreted as an official one. I'm in a private trip and I like to be with Bill Watson home. Thank you, Bill, a lot. And I'm happy to share with you my views on this issue as well. So a lot has been said on the Ukrainian crisis, and I could sum up probably in some general remarks. And the first one that came to my mind after listening all this free, insightful presentation is that we are dealing now with the most serious crisis in Europe since the end of the Second World War. It's for the first time when a territory of a state is illegally annexed by a state which is a nuclear state and is a member of the UN Security Council. So the second issue that I would like to point is that the norms and principles that guide relations between states have been seriously challenged and have been put into question as never before. All these principles that we can see in the UN Charter and in the Helsinki Final Act, like respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity, inviolability of frontiers, peaceful settlement of disputes, non-interference in internal affairs of states, non-use of force or non-use of threat to use force, all these principles have been violated, as Olena said. So we are dealing with, as I said, with one of the most serious crises. Jillian, in the first speech, also mentioned about Budapest Memorandum. Indeed, in '94, UK, US, and the Russian Federation undertook the commitment to guarantee the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. In exchange, Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons. Ukraine has complied, gave up its nuclear weapons. What we have 20 years later, the territory is illegally annexed, and we have the war in Donetsk and Lugansk. So this undermines the credibility of commitments undertaken in international relations. And now I would like, as saying a joke, probably, but wish you good luck in convincing other states to give up their nuclear weapons. So after thinking of these general remarks, speaking about the crisis in Ukraine, although this is a crisis, it still is not a single one. It's not a standalone issue. The crisis indeed is about Ukraine, but is also about the role of Russia in Europe, the relationship between Russia and the West, and the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. And although this crisis was generated by the actions of the Russian Federation, it was preceded by other important developments we have seen in Europe. So we may start, and probably here, when I'm saying my comments, I risk raising lots of criticism, but I'll try to bring also other perspective. There have been different perceptions of the NATO enlargement and the deployment of ballistic missile defense system in Europe. It is well known that Russia is very resistant to NATO enlargement to the east, in particularly accepting countries from the former Soviet Union. And not surprisingly, in the military doctrine of the Russian Federation in December 2014, you will see that NATO expansion to the east, or military infrastructure expansion to the east, is perceived as the threat for the Russian Federation. So in 2008, if we go back a little bit in the history, at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008, although Georgia and Ukraine were not given clear perspective on NATO membership, not starting the membership action plan, the declaration finally stated that Georgia and Ukraine one day will become NATO members. So of course Russia is very resistant on accepting any of these states from the former Soviet Union. And this is in April, 2008 August, the Russian-Georgian war. Coincidentally or not, developments are there. So of course, and in Ukraine, what happened in February, change of power, new leadership which wants closer ties with the European Union. The result is clear. In a month later, Crimea is annexed, and further on, invasion or destabilization of situation in Donetsk and Lugansk. The second event that has perceived all this crisis in Ukraine is the crisis in the conventional arms control regime in Europe. I don't know how many people know about the CFE Treaty, the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe. I'm dealing a lot with it. But it was a treaty that brought together the West, US, and the Russian Federation, the Soviet Union. And it was a treaty that would ensure transparency, predictability. States would exchange military information, would accept military inspections, and so on. Well, in 2007, in December, Russian Federation suspended its implementation of the treaty. Should the Russian Federation implement its commitments under this treaty, maybe in August 2008, other countries would have seen concentration of forces on the border with Georgia. So maybe this crisis could have been avoided. Finally, in March this year, Russia completely suspended its participation in this convention, in the CFE treaty. So it is, but this is also, so this is another element that decreases trust and transparency in European security. The third element, we have lots of frozen conflicts, and for the last 20 years, frozen conflicts, I mean Abkhazia, Ossetia in Georgia, Transnistria in Moldova, Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan. So for the last 20 years, the conflicts have not been solved. Basically, we risk having another frozen conflicts in Ukraine. So there is also, the international community should step up its efforts to solve these frozen conflicts. As a way forward to the crisis current in Europe, well, it's a difficult task, not an easy one. We hear different measures, starting from sanctions, supply of military weapons. Well, we can discuss all about these measures, but the goal, especially when we speak about sanctions, sanctions should be a tool, not a goal. Our goal is to bring all the sides, including Russia, to respect the norms and principles of international law. Because when I said that these norms have been challenged, the question is, should we rewrite new ones? The answer is definitely not. We have good principles and norms. And the issue is of political will to implement these norms and principles. And therefore, the question is, how do we make the implementation to be more effective? And how do we make that all states adhere to these principles that are enshrined in the UN Charter, in the Helsinki Final Act? We definitely need to avoid a new frozen conflict in Europe. And the experience from other conflicts shows that if we don't tackle this conflict immediately, then we risk having another frozen conflict. Of course, we can say about different measures. There has been some very good deals signed. In September 5th and September 19th last year, Minsk Protocol and Minsk Memorandum on Ukraine. On February 12th this year, the package of measures. So there have been agreements signed. The issue is its implementation. So because all the time we have seen this Minsk Protocol and Minsk Memorandum in September, it seems a good deal. Later on, we have seen violation of the ceasefire. And in December, and basically in January, the military clashes intensified in Ukraine, in Donetsk and Lugansk. As a result, we got the February 12th package measures deal. So will it be a long-lasting one? I'm reading every time the news, and there is always cases of violation of the ceasefire. So I would like to end up on also as a possible way that by saying that every country has the right to decide its own choice, and nobody from abroad should impose its decision on this country. If Ukraine wants to be a European country, it's up to Ukrainians. If Ukrainians want to be a unitary state or federation, it's up to Ukrainians to decide, but not to be imposed from abroad. And on this, I guess I will stop, Director.
Vitalie, let's thank you very much. Given the weakness and the disregarded promises, the Budapest guarantees of 1994 in exchange for Ukraine turning over its nuclear arsenal, I would ask you to comment on that, and then the other three as well. Well, what's the perception of America seen from Ukraine? I would think that it would be a combination of frustration and disappointment and a degree of cynicism. What good is America in the world of 2015?
Well, I will try to see if I understood correctly the question, but indeed, for the Russian, if we look at their perspective on the implementation of the agreement, the Russian basically strategy and tactic is to distance itself as much as possible from conflicts and to push the Ukrainian authorities to negotiate directly with Donetsk and Lugansk. And this...
To reframe it as more of a civil war, in other words.
To reframe, yeah, that's why sometimes when we say, is it a crisis in Ukraine or it's a crisis in and around Ukraine? And definitely Russia is trying to distance itself, and by promoting this strategy, we may end up with another frozen conflict. And Ukrainian is trying to resist this, and that is why it keeps discussion and dialogue on much higher level, on a Normandy format with France, Germany, Russian Federation, and Ukraine. So that you can see the resistance from the Ukraine not to have another frozen conflict. So for the Russian Federation, you can see it's a very good as a chess player, chessboard. We had the conflicts in Abkhazia, in South Ossetia, Transnistria. So there is already the experience in dealing with frozen conflicts. Ukraine is a new nation and is trying to deal with it, but it's very difficult when you have a very strategic apparatus that knows already and has the experience and expertise on how to deal with the frozen conflicts. Well, about the West, US, of course, Ukraine is looking towards the West for the assistance, because alone it's very difficult to stand alone with the Russian Federation. What kind of assistance should be provided? Very often we hear that military weapons and so on. The point is that the assistance should not bring to further escalation of the conflict, but it should rather bring parties to dialogue. And I would say, probably many would not agree, but we need to change the philosophy of confrontation by all, Russia, US, EU, in one of engagement, because isolating one country will not bring a solution to the crisis. I'm not sure if I understood correctly.
No, that's helpful. That moves the discussion along for me. It helps my perspective. Let me ask you, Olena, from the time you've spent in the United States previously as a graduate student and now being a U.S. resident with your family, your extended family, but very recently removed from the perspective of your native Ukraine, how is America seen from Ukraine? And so far, what would you say Americans think looking over there about Ukraine, or is there largely an indifference towards Ukraine?
Well, I would say I'm still very much in touch with my friends and family in Ukraine. So when things became violent and Russia started stepping in, and it was a year ago when the drills started happening at the border on the eastern border of Ukraine, and that was the first alert for people of Ukraine, thinking what is going to happen. Ukrainian army and military forces by no means any measure to Russian military force, and it's very obvious and everyone knows that. So my friends on Skype, their first question was, so when are you guys sending help to us? And my reply was them, huh? So that's pretty much, I think I can't speak for all of the people from Ukraine, but from the people that I am in touch with, from my friends and family, At the beginning, there was a big expectation of the help, but as time has progressed and no help has come, it is a huge disillusion for Ukrainians, especially when we talk about Budapest Memorandum, because nobody has expected that, and because the other countries that signed they guarantee the territorial integrity. Well, one of those countries actually invaded us. That is a big, it's just a big slap on the face, and understanding that international community just expresses deep concern. There's actually a lot of jokes in our culture now regarding the deep concern of the West, because when we have people dying, the West is concerned, and we are deeply concerned, and we're deeply concerned, and that's the response that's the Ukrainian people hear most of the times, that we are supporting the nation of Ukraine, and we are concerned as what is happening.
So you're saying it's deeply concerned is an empty phrase as it is perceived.
Yes, that led to a lot of disillusion and kind of a sarcastic attitude in the country. That's what I can speak of.
Anastasiya, you're in your early 20s. You're doing the transparency work. What the people that are trying to rebuild civil society that you told us about, the working groups, it's so admirable. It's so stirring. Is there a sense of being deserted or alone or ignored when your generation of Ukrainians looks to the West?
I don't think so. We have got a lot of attention from the West lately. There have been many experts from Europe and from the US coming into Ukraine and trying to talk with us and asking like where the help is needed. But people appreciate what is already done to Ukraine, especially by the US and Lithuania, if you look at Europe. But I think what we would want is to get the, not the fish, but the fish stick, is like helping the civil society which is in Ukraine to rebuild it. So I think that would be a good help. And if in terms of money and the soldiers, maybe sending some help through NGOs to voluntary organizations which emerge, which would help the soldiers there, not through the government, that would be helpful, I think.
Jillian, a year removed from your 10 days that you spent in Ukraine in April 2014, from the perspective of New York, the media capital of the USA and of the world, and you mentioned in your remarks the tendency of ISIS and the Middle East chaos to crowd this out of the news. As you follow the flow of the news for National Review, is America sort of moving on? Is Ukraine consigned to the second or third tier of awareness?
I think it has been, and I've been pretty outraged by that. I mean, I think it's such a critical thing that's happening right in Europe. They've done a phenomenal job of explaining why this matters. And it baffles me that it's being crowded out. I mean, I understand what's going on in the Middle East is very serious, but I think what's happening in Europe is very serious as well. And another thing I want to touch on with the media is the role that Russian propaganda has played in this. That's been fascinating for me to watch as a journalist, because when I was preparing to go to Ukraine, there were some things that I was reading that gave me pause for thought. I was reading that perhaps the Maidaners were radicals, perhaps some of them were neo-Nazis. So when I went there, I tried to find some because I wanted to talk with them, and I couldn't find any. I mean, it is fascinating to me to watch how effective Russian propaganda has been in influencing the way that the West reports on this conflict. And another way that I'll share this, you know, when I was over there writing, all of a sudden we had commenters who were very pro-Russian, very anti-Ukrainian, people who'd never commented on National Review before, somehow just making these very compelling arguments after every article that I wrote. So I think that the role that propaganda has played has really skewed Americans' objectivity to this situation. It's much easier to support Maidaners knowing that they want freedom and democracy if you don't have suspicions in the back of your mind that they might be neo-Nazis, that they might be anti-Semitic. And I think that that's something that Putin's really learned from the experience of the Soviet Union, the power of propaganda. You see it with Russia today. In New York, you see Russia Today propaganda posters sometimes on subways. They've taken out ads, so that's lovely. But I think that's something that's really contributed to poor understanding of the crisis.
Is there a major U.S. news organization that you think is doing a good job of staying on top of Ukraine, reporting and tracking it?
I think the Wall Street Journal has done a great job. I also generally like The Economist. I know that's not American, but The Economist has done a pretty good job of covering it, I've thought. I would just like to see much more content about it because I think it's so critical. I mean, I get that what's happening in the Middle East is drawing eyes, but I think part of what we also have at work here is the U.S. kind of has conflict fatigue after a decade, and there's this deep impulse in politics, you see it on the right and the left, to withdraw from international affairs, to pull ourselves back. And I think we've seen almost 8 years of that now. And the effects on the world have been devastating. Just objectively speaking, agree with it or disagree with it, I think the world order is much less stable now than it was when we were being the world's policemen.
Rand Paul candidacy for president is going to be one of the focal points of that. It's a legitimate debate for Americans to be having, and Rand Paul is going to be one of the factors in all of that, as having announced his candidacy just this week for president. Let's take a few questions or comments from you, please. Bill Watson, you helped make the program possible. Please start.
Exactly a week ago tonight, last Wednesday night, Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham spoke at the Opera House in Denver. I don't know if anybody else was here, but they made the comment. That we should be arming the Ukrainians immediately. Now, if you don't agree with that, why? And I know Vitalie said we just need to talk more. There comes a time when the talk is over. I mean, Chamberlain still wanted to talk to Hitler. Some people are still saying we could talk to ISIS. It comes a time when we have to start kicking some butt.
Spoken in a language understood internationally. Vitalie.
Do we take more questions, or
well,
how it's the?
How do you comment on your friend Professor Watson saying that two prominent U.S. senators on the Republican side say send lethal military aid?
Well, I know that Senator McCain has also another comment that we should stand alone, Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. I like it very much, that statement as well. On arming Ukraine, yeah, we may have different views. So this is a double coin. It has pros and cons. So it's indeed Ukraine cannot stand alone with the Russian Federation army. That's clear, and the support assistance is needed. Now, hypothetically, just imagine how much of my military support could the US provide to Ukraine? Will the US be able to provide at the same scale, at the same level as the Russian will provide to the rebels? Because if the Russian Federation so far has managed very well to deny any of its military involvement in the conflict. They say there is no military troops. They say there is no military armament. People who are fighting, they are volunteers. They are not regular army. By providing military weapons to Ukraine, it will give pretext to Russia to start openly arming the rebels. And imagine that some Russian soldiers will die from American weapons. Mm-hmm. The public opinion will think that the Russian leadership is weak, and the stakes for Ukraine for Russia are much higher than for US. And I'm afraid that the US will not be able to provide at the same level as the Russian Federation is providing. And
just pause there. Olena, how do you see this?
I could say that there are many Ukrainians who would really like what you just said happen in Ukraine, but I also agree with Vitalie, what long term are we looking at? Because, well, yeah, if there was no Russian money and Russian arms, there would be no war in Ukraine at this point. And by, as Vitalie was mentioning, by withholding from officially recognizing its presence in Russia, I mean its Russian presence in Ukraine, Russia is playing this fine game. And the moment then the lethal weapon would be there, there will be that will just change the whole game plan. And I'm not sure how it will look like for international context and international relations if there will be an open confrontation, hot stage of war between Russia and pretty much Ukrainian army that is armed by U.S. At this point, there are Russian soldiers that are dying in Ukraine. There is standing Russian army. There are Russian generals. There is enough proof of that, but it's not official. We're all laughing, right, when we say, well, there's no Russian troops, and everyone laughs because everyone knows that they're there. But Putin does not recognize that, and so pretending they are not there. Another idea is that Ukraine used to have a huge potential, heavy industry potential. We used to produce a lot of arms ourselves, military. We had a huge a lot of military plants. Investing in that and helping to boost the economy through the empowering the people and through helping Ukraine to help itself might also be a good idea.
The analogy that occurs to me as I hear both of you comment on Professor Watson's challenge is a poker game, and who has more chips to push in if the ante is raised with lethal military aid from the U.S. That arguably Putin has more chips to push in, and he is next door, and we might not be able to continue to meet the betting. Let's just take one or two more. Dan Kurs, please.
I had heard that there's an influence of oil both in Ukraine and Crimea, and I was wondering if you'd comment on the veracity of the factor that oil is involved.
You mean oil production or oil supply and oil and gas supplied from?
I mean, I believe I've heard that was an oil-rich country.
I can take this one if you want.
Go ahead.
So I think a lot of what we've seen Russia do historically, it's a major energy-producing state, and you've seen it use that to try to bully Europe. You've seen them say we're going to cut off the heat. It's a cold winter for you. Wouldn't it be too bad if you had to spend a cold? We're Russia. We can do that to you. So I think this is very much about energy. It's about Russia viewing energy as a geopolitical strength and as something that it can use to back its diplomacy and give it teeth. Russia is also, trying to take parts of Ukraine that are also very energy rich, which would be a major asset. I think what the United States fails to realize, this is a notable statistic, the U.S. surpassed Russia as the world's top natural gas producing state just a couple of years ago. So I think this is one thing that the U.S. isn't making the most of its diplomatic resources with energy, and that is that we could be relieving that by putting more oil and gas in the international marketplace. Wouldn't even necessarily have to go to Europe. That would flood the market a little bit more, give Europe more options, and make that a little bit looser and really open up some potential where Russia doesn't have that diplomatic stronghold. That's something, aside from military aid, that we haven't done.
Yeah. And
Please, go ahead.
I just wanted to add with Europe, because Europe has been very concerned about events in Ukraine because they were very reluctant with the sanctions because of their high dependency on Russian energy supply, the Russian gas, and they are dependent on it, and therefore they voice their support of Ukraine, but they also realize how little they can do because of their dependency on Russia.
We're on about a little over 90 minutes now, and I try to live by Andrew's first law of the lecture hall, which is the mind cannot absorb what the posterior cannot endure. There's lots of fascinating avenues we could explore, but I do see a hand from one of our 1776 scholars, and maybe we'll give Ellen Densmore the last question and then wrap it up, and you can visit individually with our guest speakers. Ellen?
So we've expansion. You had mentioned that this is a Ukrainian issue and that Ukraine needs to deal with it to make their own decisions without imposed opinions from the West and from other nations. But I'm curious what your opinion is of NATO. Is NATO an engine that should be used to curb Russian expansion? And if so, how should NATO be going about countering Russia?
I can say, can I?
Please.
I can say from just historical factors and the social perspective of Ukrainians. Before the invasion and before annexation of Crimea, most of the Poles, most of the population of Ukraine did not support joining NATO. Most of the people did not want to be in part of NATO. Unfortunately, or fortunately, as the things happened with Russia, most of the population of Ukraine now, according to the social polls, actually want to be part of NATO, which actually poses a huge threat because, in my personal opinion, if Ukraine would stay away from joining NATO, at least at this stage of development, that could be a compromise with Russia. One of the main reasons, and Putin openly told it just recently, a year after annexing Crimea, they had to come in and take Crimea, otherwise it would be a NATO port. Crimea is the only place where Russia has access to warm water. They have stationed their fleet from Soviet times in Crimea. After collapse of Soviet Union, this is the only place where Russia is having its fleet. Ukraine rented it out, and has been renting it out to Russia. So the Russian military in Ukrainian land, their families, the fleet is stationed there. It's been stationed for 23 years after collapse of Soviet Union. And the fact that Ukraine could have potentially moved to NATO, and that the Black Sea would become a baseline, the base for NATO. That's why Putin had to come in. He said that himself just recently in that movie.
Freedom is indivisible. We're reminded tonight that Colorado and Wyoming connect to Ukraine. But we must remember that that connects in turn to Lithuania, where Olena and Anastasiya studied with Kyle Usry, which connects in turn to the Mexican border, which connects to the Canadian tar sands, which connects to the rogue state of North Korea, which connects to the Iranian nuclear breakout capacity under negotiation, which connects to ISIS, and so on and so on. Freedom is indivisible. The planet is very, very small. Just think of the discussion of social media that's woven throughout, and the internet that is woven throughout this evening's fascinating presentations. We thank Olena, Poplavska, Anastasiya, Kozlovtseva, Vitalie Diaconu, and Jillian Melchior. It's been magnificent. I remind you, we'll do Issue Monday in this hall on May 11 with a post-session legislative report from leaders of the State House and Senate, Republican and Democratic parties. We have our next Women's Luncheon with Laura Carno on winning messages coming up May 15. We have the Summit and the Young Conservatives Leadership Conference. Information about that was on your chairs coming up in late June. We'd love to see many of you at all of those upcoming events. Now thank, please, our panelists, and we will be adjourned.